There's a particular kind of dinner table where everything looks warm and nothing actually is: paper dinosaur plates, a half-eaten sheet cake shaped like a stegosaurus, my 6-year-old son still wearing the foil party crown someone had given him at school that morning, and underneath all of it, a current of something cold I couldn't yet name, running between my mother-in-law and my wife like a wire I hadn't noticed I was standing too close to. My name is Marcus, and that birthday dinner, on a humid evening in June, wasn't the night I learned the truth about my marriage. It was only the first night I felt it, the way you feel a draft in a house before you find the open window. I build furniture for a living, custom tables, cabinetry, the occasional staircase, out of a workshop on the industrial edge of Peoria that I'd been slowly turning into a real storefront for almost 2 years. My wife, Olivia, managed facilities contracts for the regional hospital downtown, the kind of job that came with steady hours and a salary that, if I'm honest, had carried us through more than one lean year while my business found its footing. We'd been married 9 years. Our son, Eli, was turning 6 that night, and he was dinosaur-obsessed in the specific, exhausting way only 6-year-olds can be, correcting anyone who called a pterodactyl a dinosaur with the seriousness of a man twice his age. Olivia's mother, Patricia, had hosted the party at her own house, the way she hosted most family occasions, a widow in her early 60s who'd built a modest fortune out of 3 rental duplexes on the east side of town and had never, in 9 years, fully forgiven me for not being the man she'd once imagined for her daughter. There had been someone before me, briefly, years before Olivia and I met, a young orthopedic resident named Charles, introduced by a family friend, the kind of man Patricia still mentioned occasionally, almost fondly, the way you mention a road not taken. I'd spent 9 years trying to win her over anyway, partly because Olivia loved her mother fiercely, and partly, though I didn't fully understand this about myself until much later, because my own mother had died when I was 23, and some unspoken part of me had spent a decade quietly hoping Patricia might eventually feel like a replacement for something I'd lost. That hunger for her approval is the thing you need to understand about me before anything else happens, because it explains almost everything I let pass without question. The contractor, Trevor, was at the party that night too, hanging a string of paper bats, leftover decorations mixed in with dinosaur banners, because Patricia never threw anything away, and helping carry folding chairs in from the garage like he was practically family. Patricia had hired him about a year earlier to renovate one of her duplexes on Sycamore Street, and somewhere along the way he'd become a fixture at her gatherings, easy and likable, divorced, somewhere in his early 40s, with the kind of relaxed confidence that made him good at his job and, I'd assumed without thinking much about it, good at being liked. I noticed Olivia laughing at something he said while she carried out a tray of lemonade, a real laugh, unguarded in a way I hadn't seen from her in longer than I wanted to admit. I noticed it the way you notice anything, briefly, without weight, and went back to refilling Eli's water cup. What I noticed next, I didn't let myself weigh properly until much later. Near the end of the evening, while Eli tore into presents on the living room floor, I walked into the kitchen for more napkins and found Patricia pressing a folded envelope into Olivia's hand, both of them turned slightly away from the doorway, voices low. "For emergencies," Patricia said. "Don't tell Marcus the exact amount. He worries about money enough as it is." Olivia tucked it into her purse fast, fingers quick, the motion of someone who'd done this before and knew exactly how to make it look casual. When she turned and saw me standing there, something flickered across her face, not guilt exactly, more like recalibration, the look of someone adjusting a story in real time. "Mom's helping with Eli's summer camp deposit," she said, smiling in a way that almost worked. "I forgot to mention it." I said that was generous of her, and meant it, because I had no reason yet not to. I carried the napkins back to the dining room and didn't think about the envelope again that night, except for one small, persistent detail that stayed with me longer than it should have. Patricia's instruction hadn't been "Don't worry Marcus about it." It had been "Don't tell Marcus the exact amount." There's a difference between those two sentences, even if I didn't fully understand the weight of it yet, standing in that kitchen with a stack of paper napkins shaped like brontosauruses, watching my wife's purse close around something I wasn't meant to see the full size of. Eli blew out his candles a few minutes later, made a wish I never found out, and the evening folded back into ordinary warmth, cake, cleanup, the long drive home with a sleepy 6-year-old in the back seat clutching a stuffed triceratops that had been Patricia's gift, the one she'd made a point of buying herself rather than letting me and Olivia pick out together, the way she always seemed to find one small way, in every gathering, to remind everyone whose house we were really guests in, even when it was technically a birthday for my own son. I drove home that night turning over a feeling I couldn't yet name, not suspicion exactly, more like the early, formless unease of a man who senses a structural problem in a building before he can point to which beam is failing. I told myself it was nothing. Patricia had never liked me much, that wasn't new information, and a little maternal favoritism toward her own daughter wasn't evidence of anything beyond what it had always been, an old, familiar friction I'd learned to live around for 9 years, the way you learn to live around a creaky stair you've stopped consciously noticing. I didn't know yet that the creaky stair had been creaking for a reason. I only knew, pulling into our driveway with Eli asleep behind me and a triceratops slipping out of his loosened grip, that something in the evening had left a small, cold residue I couldn't quite wash off, and that for the first time in 9 years of marriage, I'd watched my wife and her mother exchange something, money, a secret, an instruction, and felt, however faintly, like the one person in the house who wasn't being told the whole story. For most of that summer, life folded back into its usual shape so completely that I almost forgot the birthday party had unsettled me at all. My business was at the stage every small business eventually reaches, the good kind of overwhelming, 3 custom dining sets and a built-in bookcase commission stacked up, plus the slow grind of finally signing a lease on a real storefront on Knoxville Avenue instead of running everything out of a rented warehouse bay. It meant long hours. 12-hour days weren't unusual, and weekends often meant sanding cabinet faces in the shop while Olivia took Eli to the splash pad or to Patricia's pool, which had become, almost without my noticing the shift, the default plan for nearly every Saturday. I want to be honest about my own part in what happened, because it matters. I was proud of the business growing, and that pride made it easy to justify the hours, easy to tell myself that providing was its own form of presence, even when I wasn't actually there. Looking back now, I can see how convenient that belief was, how it let me hand over more and more of our family's social and emotional life to Patricia's house without ever quite admitting that's what I was doing. The first thing I noticed, without yet attaching any real weight to it, was how often "Mom needs help with the rental" became the explanation for Olivia's evenings. Patricia had recently bought a second duplex on Sycamore Street, a fixer-upper she planned to renovate and lease, and Trevor was doing the work, a full kitchen gut, new flooring, a bathroom remodel. Olivia started going over 2, sometimes 3 evenings a week, ostensibly to help her mother with paint colors and tenant paperwork, things that, in 9 years, I'd never once seen Olivia particularly interested in. "Mom's overwhelmed with the property stuff," she said, the first time I mentioned the new pattern, somewhere in early July. "She doesn't have anyone else to help her think it through." It was a reasonable explanation. Patricia had been managing rentals alone since her husband died, and asking her daughter for help wasn't strange on its own. What I didn't examine, not yet, was why those evenings always seemed to run 2 hours longer than the task described, or why Olivia came home from them with a particular kind of brightness that felt different from the tired satisfaction of helping a parent with chores. My father, Walter, a retired mechanic, widowed like Patricia, though in every other way her opposite, came over for dinner one Sunday in July and made an offhand comment that I filed away without examining too closely, the same way I'd been filing away everything that summer. "Patricia's always been good at finding reasons to keep Olivia close," he said, watching Eli chase fireflies in the backyard while we sat on the porch with beers. "She did it before you two got married too. You remember that doctor she kept pushing? Charles?" He shook his head, more amused than bitter. "Some people just don't like sharing what they think belongs to them." "She's not trying to take Olivia from me, Dad," I said, half laughing. "She's just close with her daughter." Walter said, in the particular tone of a man who'd decided not to push further, and we let the subject drop into the sound of cicadas and Eli's delighted shrieking over a firefly he'd finally caught. I think now about how easily I dismissed that conversation, how readily I reached for the most comfortable explanation available: she's just close with her daughter, instead of asking myself why that closeness had started requiring quite so much of my wife's time, or why it had escalated noticeably in the months since Trevor started working on Sycamore Street. Renee, Olivia's closest friend since college and a nurse at the same hospital, came over for a barbecue in early August, and I remember catching her watching Olivia across the yard with an expression I couldn't quite place, not suspicion exactly, more like the careful neutrality of someone holding something she'd decided wasn't hers to share. When I asked, half joking, if Olivia had been working her too hard lately, Renee laughed it off too fast and changed the subject to Eli's dinosaur facts, and I let it go, because pressing further would have required acknowledging a discomfort I wasn't ready to name even to myself. By late August, the pattern had become background noise rather than anything I actively questioned: Olivia at Sycamore Street 2 or 3 evenings a week, Patricia calling more frequently than usual, a new lightness in Olivia's mood on the evenings she came home from her mother's that didn't quite match the mundane work she described doing. I noticed she'd started wearing her hair down more often, a small thing, the kind of detail that means nothing on its own and only becomes a pattern once you've already started, somewhere in your gut, keeping score. The night that finally cracked the surface, slightly, came at the end of August, when Patricia called the house phone, something she almost never did, preferring to call Olivia's cell, and I picked up by accident before Olivia could get to it. "Is Olivia there?" Patricia asked, and then, before I could answer, added, almost to herself, "Tell her Trevor needs to reschedule for Thursday instead of Wednesday." "Trevor?" I said. "The contractor?" A pause, half a second too long. "For the duplex," Patricia said, recovering smoothly. "He's behind on the flooring." I handed the phone to Olivia when she came downstairs, and she took the message without any visible reaction, relaying it to me afterward as casually as any other scheduling detail. "Trevor's pushing our walk through to Thursday." I nodded, went back to the cabinet drawing spread across the kitchen table, and didn't think much more about it that night. Looking back now, that half-second pause on the phone is one of the moments I keep returning to, a small hesitation in Patricia's voice, almost nothing, the kind of thing you'd need to already be looking for in order to notice at all. I wasn't looking for it yet. I was still, that August, a man who believed the people closest to him simply didn't have reasons to lie, and that belief, more than any specific piece of evidence I missed, was the real reason it took me as long as it did to see what was already happening 2 evenings a week, 20 minutes from my own house, in a duplex my mother-in-law owned and was paying a man named Trevor to slowly, carefully renovate. September brought the first moment I couldn't fully explain away, though it took me most of the month to admit that to myself. Eli started kindergarten that fall, and the new school routine meant I was handling more morning drop-offs while Olivia left earlier for the hospital, which gave me a window into her schedule I hadn't paid close attention to before. I noticed, putting away laundry one evening, a receipt from a coffee shop on the east side, dated a Tuesday afternoon when Olivia had told me she had a vendor meeting downtown, a coffee shop a few blocks from Sycamore Street, not downtown at all. I didn't say anything. I told myself there were a dozen explanations: she'd grabbed coffee on her way to or from the rental, the geography wasn't as damning as it felt in the moment. I put the receipt in the recycling and went back to dinner prep, and some part of me, even then, recognized that I was doing exactly what I'd watched my father describe Patricia doing for years, finding the explanation that let me keep things comfortable, rather than the one that matched what was actually in front of me. The second crack came from our own joint finances. I'd been pulling money steadily into a business expansion account to cover the storefront build-out, new flooring, signage, a down payment on equipment, and in mid-September, reviewing the account before a meeting with my contractor, I found it nearly $4,000 lighter than my last calculation. When I asked Olivia about it, she said she'd needed to help her mother cover an unexpected repair bill at the duplex, a burst pipe, something urgent, and she'd meant to tell me and it had slipped her mind in the chaos of Eli starting school. It was plausible. It was also the second time in 2 months that money had moved between our household and Patricia's properties without my full knowledge beforehand, and when I raised the idea, gently, that we should talk before pulling from the business account again, Olivia's response had an edge to it I wasn't used to hearing. It's my mother, Marcus. I'm not going to make her wait for a wire transfer while you sign off on it like I need permission. I backed off immediately, the way I always did when conversations with Olivia started drifting toward anything involving her mother, because some old, exhausted part of me still associated conflict with Patricia as conflict with the entire family I'd spent 9 years trying to belong to. I told myself I was being a good husband by not pushing, by trusting Olivia's judgment about her own mother's needs. What I was actually doing, I understand now, was avoiding the one conversation that might have forced me to look directly at a pattern I'd already half noticed and didn't want to confirm. Renee came over again in early October, this time without Olivia, dropping off a casserole dish she'd borrowed weeks earlier, and she stood in my kitchen doorway for a long moment before she finally said something. "How are things?" "Really?" she asked, and there was a weight in the question that didn't match its casualness. "Fine," I said. "Busy. Storefront's almost ready." She nodded, glanced toward the window for a second too long, and said, "Just make sure you're paying attention, okay? To everything. Not just the storefront." Then, before I could ask what she meant, she said she had to get to a shift and left, the screen door clicking shut behind her with a finality that felt, even at the time, like more than a casserole dish being returned. I stood in the kitchen for several minutes after she left, turning her sentence over, and felt the same cold residue I'd felt walking out of Patricia's kitchen back in June with that folded envelope still in my mind. Make sure you're paying attention to everything. I told myself she meant the business, the long hours, the marriage strain that came with any growing company. I think now that some part of me knew, even then, that wasn't really what she meant. The moment that finally tipped suspicion into something I could no longer fully rationalize came in late October. I'd driven past Sycamore Street on my way back from a lumber supplier, a route I rarely took, and saw Olivia's car parked in the duplex gravel driveway at 4 in the afternoon on a Thursday, a day she'd told me that morning she had a full schedule of vendor calls at the hospital. Trevor's truck was parked beside it. The blinds in the front window, freshly installed as part of the renovation, were drawn. I didn't stop. I drove past, hands tight on the wheel, telling myself there were entirely reasonable explanations. She'd left work early to check on the flooring progress, Patricia had asked her to meet Trevor about a permit issue, any number of mundane reasons a grown woman might be at her mother's rental property on a weekday afternoon. I built the explanation the same careful, deliberate way I'd been building explanations all summer, and for the first time, I noticed how much effort that building had started to require. That night, lying awake next to Olivia after she'd come home and described, unprompted, a long and detailed afternoon of vendor calls that, I now knew for certain, hadn't happened the way she said, I felt something shift inside me that I didn't yet have words for, not anger exactly, something closer to grief arriving early, uninvited, ahead of any confirmation I was willing to call definitive. Looking back, that drawn blind afternoon on Sycamore Street is the moment I'd point to now as the real turning point, not because anything was confirmed that day, but because it was the first time I let myself fully register a lie in real time, while it was being told to my face, and chose to stay quiet anyway. I told myself I was protecting the marriage. I think, more honestly, I was protecting myself from a conversation that might force me to choose between the life I had and the truth underneath it, and some part of me, even then, suspected which way that choice would go. By November, I had stopped believing the explanations I'd spent the autumn constructing. I just hadn't yet decided what I was going to do with that knowledge, and in the gap between knowing and acting, I kept building furniture, kept signing off on storefront permits, kept watching my wife drive toward a rental property on Sycamore Street 2 or 3 evenings a week, telling myself I was being patient when really I had simply run out of better explanations and hadn't yet found the courage to ask for worse ones. The decision to actually look, rather than simply notice, arrived the way it often does, not through resolve, but through an accident that made denial briefly impossible. In mid-November, finalizing numbers for the storefront's equipment financing, I discovered the business expansion account was missing far more than the $4,000 Olivia had explained back in September. The real total was closer to $8,000, transferred out in smaller increments over 4 months, each one timed to coincide loosely with the evenings she'd spent at Sycamore Street. When I pulled the joint personal account statements as well, I found something worse, a pattern of cash withdrawals from Patricia's accounts, visible because Patricia and Olivia shared an old joint savings account from years earlier that Olivia still had access to, totaling over $30,000 across the past year, money that, as far as I could tell, had nothing to do with rental repairs or renovation costs that Trevor's invoices, which I tracked down through the duplex permit office, didn't come close to justifying. $8,000 from our business. Over $30,000 moving through Patricia's accounts. $42,000, give or take, that I could trace with no clear destination except a vague pattern of timing that lined up, again and again, with Olivia's evenings on Sycamore Street. I drove to the duplex itself the following Saturday, using the excuse of dropping off a level Trevor had borrowed from my shop weeks earlier, genuinely intending nothing more than to see the renovation progress with my own eyes. Patricia was there, supervising paint color swatches against the newly finished kitchen wall, and she greeted me with the particular brisk warmth she reserved for moments when she wanted to control a conversation before it started. "Trevor's just stepping out for supplies," she said, before I'd asked. "You can leave the level on the counter." I set it down and let my eyes move, deliberately, around the space, a kitchen nearly finished, new cabinets, fresh paint, and on the counter beside an unopened box of tile samples, a candle I recognized immediately, the same scent Olivia had started keeping on our own nightstand sometime that summer, a detail too specific to be coincidence. Beside it, half tucked under a folded drop cloth, a man's flannel shirt that wasn't Trevor's size by half, too small across the shoulders for the man I'd watched carry folding chairs at Eli's birthday party, and then I understood, with a cold, sliding certainty, that it wasn't meant to be Trevor's at all. It was something left behind, casually, the way you leave things in a place you've started, without quite admitting it to yourself, treating as your own. "Olivia's been a big help with the design choices," Patricia said, watching me notice the candle without quite meeting my eyes. "She has good taste." I said something non-committal and left a few minutes later, the level still sitting on the counter, my hand steady on the steering wheel in a way that frightened me a little once I noticed it, the same unnatural calm I'd later recognize as the particular stillness that arrives right before you stop being able to deny something to yourself. My father, when I told him what I'd found that evening, sitting on his porch with a beer I didn't drink, was quieter than I expected, and then more direct than he'd ever been about Patricia in 9 years. "She never wanted you to win, Marcus," he said. "Not really. Even when she let you in, some part of her was always rooting for a different ending. I should have said something sooner. I told myself it wasn't my place." I asked him what he meant, exactly, and he told me something I hadn't known, that years earlier, before our wedding, Patricia had told a mutual friend that she hoped Olivia would come to her senses before walking down the aisle, that she'd never fully accepted the marriage and had simply decided, once it happened anyway, to manage it from close enough proximity to still feel some control over how it played out. That conversation reframed 9 years of small frictions I'd absorbed as ordinary in-law tension into something with a shape and an intention behind it. It didn't yet tell me everything, but it told me Patricia's role in whatever was happening on Sycamore Street wasn't passive ignorance. It was something closer to permission. Renee finally broke her silence the week after Thanksgiving, calling me late on a Tuesday night, her voice tight with something that sounded like guilt that had been accumulating for months. "I should have told you in October," she said. "I saw them leaving a hotel off Knoxville Avenue back in September. I told myself it wasn't my business, that maybe I'd misread it. I didn't misread it." A pause. "And Patricia knew before I did, Marcus. Olivia told me once, months ago, that her mom had practically encouraged it, said something like, 'You deserve to feel like yourself again,' after Olivia complained about how much you were working. I didn't understand what that meant until I saw them at the hotel." I sat with the phone against my ear for a long time after she finished, the pieces of the last 6 months rearranging themselves into a shape I could finally see whole, the envelope at Eli's birthday, the half-second pause on the phone call about Trevor's schedule, the candle and the too small flannel shirt on a counter in a duplex Patricia owned and had, apparently, helped turn into a space for exactly this. Not a blind eye. Active permission, financed in small, deniable increments, dressed up as maternal generosity. I didn't confront Olivia that night. I made a decision instead, the same kind of decision I'd watched myself make once before in a different context, months earlier, that I needed to see the whole thing clearly, in one place, before I let anyone talk me into a smaller, more bearable version of what had actually happened. Patricia had planned a small open house the following weekend to celebrate the finished Sycamore Street renovation, family and a few close friends, the kind of gathering where she liked to be seen as the architect of something successful. I decided I would go, and that whatever I found there, would finally say out loud. The open house was exactly the kind of small, proud gathering Patricia liked to host, fresh paint smell still faint in the air, a folding table of crackers and wine, Trevor accepting compliments on the flooring with easy modesty, Eli running between rooms delighted by the novelty of an empty house with no furniture yet to bump into. I arrived a little later than everyone else, deliberately, and found Olivia in the kitchen alone, scrolling through something on the tablet she used for managing rental paperwork, the screen angled slightly away from the doorway out of habit rather than any active attempt to hide it from me in that moment. When she looked up and saw me, she didn't immediately lock it, and in the half-second before she did, I caught enough of the open message thread to recognize Trevor's name at the top, and beneath it, a string of messages that needed no further context. Can't stop thinking about Thursday, sent that morning, hours before this gathering, while I'd been at the storefront finishing the last of the shelving installation. I didn't react the way I might have imagined, weeks earlier, that I would. I felt something close to relief, strange as that sounds, the relief of finally seeing the whole shape of a thing I'd spent 6 months only feeling the edges of. "We need to talk," I said. "Now. Not here." We ended up in the unfinished back bedroom, away from the kitchen noise, Olivia's face pale, her hands twisting the hem of her sweater in a way I'd never seen from her before. "How long?" I said. Then, when she hesitated, I asked it again, differently. "Since when, exactly?" "Since the kitchen demo started, or before that?" "Marcus. Just tell me when." I asked a third time, a different angle again, not because I hadn't understood her silence, but because no answer she gave was actually going to be the one I needed. "Was it before the birthday party in June, or after?" "Does it matter?" she said, finally, her voice cracking. "You were never home, Marcus. You were always at the shop, always behind on something, and I felt like I'd disappeared inside this life, the school drop-offs, the meal planning, being somebody's wife and somebody's mom and never just being Olivia. Trevor made me feel like myself again. That's not an excuse, but it's the truth, and you asking me the exact date isn't going to change anything that actually happened." I asked the question one more time anyway, not the date this time, but the only version of it I actually needed answered. "Did you ever plan to tell me, or was I just supposed to keep building a storefront for a family that already wasn't what I thought it was?" She didn't answer that one at all, and the silence told me more than any response could have. Patricia appeared in the doorway a few minutes later, drawn by the raised voices, and what happened next was the part one hadn't fully prepared myself for, even after everything Walter and Renee had told me. "Marcus, this isn't the place," Patricia said, stepping fully into the room, her tone the same brisk, managing warmth she used for everything, as if this were simply another logistical problem to be smoothed over before guests noticed. "You knew," I said, turning to her. "Not suspected." "Knew." "The candle. The shirt. The cash." Patricia's expression didn't crumble the way I half expected. Instead, something in her straightened, almost defiant. "I watched my daughter disappear into a marriage where she came in second to a workshop full of half-built cabinets," she said. "I'm not going to apologize for wanting her to feel like she still existed." "You financed it," I said. "You gave them a place to do it. You told her it was fine." "I told her she deserved to feel something real," Patricia said, and there was no flicker of doubt in her voice at all, only the flat certainty of someone who'd convinced herself, over months, that what she'd done was a kind of love. I never said it would be painless. I said she deserved to choose. I stood there absorbing the full architecture of it, not just an affair, but an entire family structure quietly rearranged around hiding it, financing it, normalizing it, while I'd spent the better part of a year building shelving and signing leases for a future that, in this house at least, had apparently already been declared over by people who'd decided I simply hadn't earned a vote in the matter. Trevor appeared in the doorway briefly, took in the scene, and had the decency, at least, to leave without saying anything, which was more restraint than anyone else in that room had managed all year. I didn't shout. I didn't ask the dozen smaller questions still sitting in my chest, the ones about specific nights, specific lies, specific moments I'd been standing in a different room of my own life while this one was being built without me. I found that the questions I'd actually needed answered had already been answered, fully, in the space of about 10 minutes, by Olivia's silence about her intentions, and by Patricia's unwavering certainty that she'd done nothing wrong at all. "I'm taking Eli home," I said. "We'll talk about everything else when there isn't a party happening 20 feet away." Olivia reached for my arm in the hallway and I stepped back, the way I would learn, in the months ahead, to step back from her, reaching more than once, each time with a little less effort than the last. "I want to be honest about something most people don't expect from a story like this," I tried. For nearly 4 months after that open house, I genuinely tried to forgive her. We started couples counseling in December, a small office above a dry cleaner's downtown, a calm, careful therapist who helped us name things neither of us had said out loud in 9 years, my need for Patricia's approval, Olivia's slow erosion of identity inside motherhood and marriage, the hours I'd buried myself in the shop instead of in the house. I told myself, through January and most of February, that understanding the why of what happened might be enough to eventually rebuild something on top of it. What I couldn't get past, in the end, wasn't really the affair itself, though that alone would have been enough for most people. It was the discovery, week after week in those counseling sessions and in quiet moments at home, of how completely Patricia's involvement had reshaped my understanding of the last decade. Every Thanksgiving, every small dig at my business, every, for emergencies, envelope handed across a kitchen counter, reframed now as part of a much longer pattern of a mother who had never actually accepted the marriage and had finally found, in Trevor, a project worth actively financing. I tried to separate Olivia's choices from her mother's enabling, the way the therapist encouraged me to, and some weeks I almost managed it. But every time I imagined a future together, Patricia was still in it, at every holiday, every school event, every quiet family gathering, a woman who had told me, without flinching, that she didn't regret what she'd done. I realized, somewhere in early March, that forgiving Olivia would have meant building a life that still required me to sit across a table from someone who believed she'd been right to help destroy it. I filed for divorce in April. Eli stayed mostly with me, a custody arrangement Olivia agreed to with less resistance than I expected, maybe out of guilt, maybe out of her own quiet recognition of how much of the last year she'd genuinely missed of his life while she was elsewhere. Trevor's involvement with Olivia didn't survive the spring, whether out of guilt, or simple incompatibility. Once the secrecy that had fueled it was gone, I never fully learned, and I stopped asking the kind of questions that required Olivia's continued presence in my life to answer. In June, almost exactly a year after that birthday party, Olivia showed up at the house unannounced, asking if we could talk. She'd been seeing a therapist on her own, she said. She understood now, more clearly than she had in counseling with me, how much of what happened had been tangled up with her mother's influence, how she'd let Patricia's validation stand in for the harder work of figuring out what she actually wanted. She asked, sitting at the same kitchen table where she'd once told me her mother was helping with a camp deposit, if there was any room left to try again. I thought about it longer than I expected to, not because I doubted my answer, but because some part of me wanted to be sure I wasn't closing the door out of pride instead of clarity. I thought about Eli, about the counseling sessions, about Patricia's voice saying I told her she deserved to choose without a trace of doubt in it. "No," I said, finally. "I think some part of me will always wonder how much of any apology you give me is really yours, and how much is your mother's voice underneath it, telling you what you should feel now the way she told you what to feel before. I don't want to spend the rest of my life trying to tell the difference." She didn't argue. I think some part of her had already expected that answer, had maybe even needed to hear it said plainly enough that she'd stop wondering whether the door was still open a crack. The months since have been quieter than I expected grief to be. Eli and I have settled into our own rhythm, dinosaur documentaries on Friday nights, a Saturday routine at the new storefront that's finally, genuinely thriving, partly because I no longer spend my evenings wondering where everyone else in my family actually is. My father comes by more often now, easier in his own skin around the house than he ever was when Patricia's shadow hung over every gathering. Renee still visits, a little less guarded now that she doesn't have to manage a secret she never wanted to carry in the first place. Eli asked me once, months later, while we were building a model dinosaur skeleton at the kitchen table, why we didn't go to Grandma Patricia's house anymore. I gave him some careful, age-appropriate version of the truth, and he considered it with the particular seriousness 6-year-olds reserve for questions they've clearly been turning over privately. "I like our house better anyway," he said finally, fitting a small plastic rib into place. "Everybody here actually wants me here." I didn't correct him. I'm still not sure I could have said it better myself. What appeared, for most of 9 years, to be ordinary in-law tension turned out to be something far more deliberate, not friction, but a slow, patient campaign, financed in small increments and dressed up as generosity, by a mother who had simply never accepted the marriage in the first place and finally found a way to act on that refusal without ever having to call it sabotage. This story isn't really only about Olivia and Trevor, the way it might first appear. It's about how an affair can be enabled not just by silence, but by active, ongoing permission, money quietly moved, a renovated duplex offered as cover, a daughter told repeatedly that she deserved to feel like herself again, by someone whose love for her had curdled into a need to control the shape her life took. Patricia never saw herself as the villain in this. She saw herself as a mother protecting her daughter from a marriage she'd never wanted for her, and that self-deception is, in some ways, more disturbing than simple malice would have been, because it meant she could finance years of betrayal while genuinely believing she was acting out of love. My own accumulation of denial ran on a parallel but separate track. I spent a decade mistaking my hunger for Patricia's approval as ordinary in-law diplomacy, when it was actually a wound from my own mother's early death that I'd never properly examined, a wound that made me unusually willing to overlook her dismissiveness, her quiet undermining, her insistence on managing every family gathering as though I were a guest in my own life. The accumulation effect here wasn't really about missed financial red flags, though there were plenty. It was about 9 years of small accommodations to a woman who had never once stopped treating my marriage as a temporary arrangement she was simply waiting to see corrected. The point of no return, looking back, wasn't the open house, and it wasn't even the duplex with its candle and too small flannel shirt. It came much earlier, the moment I overheard "Don't tell Marcus the exact amount" at Eli's birthday party and chose to file it away as a small, forgivable oddity rather than the first piece of evidence in a pattern that would take me a full year to finally see whole. Most family betrayals like this one don't announce themselves. They accumulate in folded envelopes and rescheduled contractor visits and evenings that run 2 hours longer than the task described, each one small enough to explain away on its own. If I try, even now, to extend some understanding toward Olivia rather than only toward myself, I think what she was actually chasing wasn't really Trevor at all. It was the specific, intoxicating feeling of being told, by someone, that she deserved more than the life she had, and her mother offered her that feeling more consistently, and more dangerously, than any affair could have on its own. That doesn't excuse what she did. It explains why her mother's involvement made it so much harder for her to stop. What I'm left with now is a clearer understanding of where my own responsibility actually sat in all of this, not in causing the affair, but in spending 9 years too afraid of losing a mother-in-law's approval to ever ask the harder question of whether that approval had ever really been offered in good faith to begin with. The hardest part of all of this wasn't losing Olivia. It was realizing how many years I spent trying to earn the approval of someone who had decided, long before I ever walked into her house, that she was never going to give it honestly. I think about that envelope on Eli's birthday more than almost anything else from that whole year, not because it was the worst thing that happened, but because it was the first true thing I was shown, and I let it pass because the truth, in that moment, was less comfortable than the story I'd already decided to believe about my own family. What looks obvious now, the candle, the half-second pauses, the evenings that ran too long, looked, at the time, like nothing at all. That's the part I'd want anyone listening to this to sit with. Sometimes the people closest to you aren't hiding the truth nearly as carefully as you think. Sometimes you're just the one who isn't ready, yet, to let yourself see it.